Okay, so before we wrap up, there are a couple issues we want to fix, and the first one being here. So when we open up the panel and we enlarge the applications window, you'll notice this happens. And the way to fix this is to actually go into the markup for the settings dialog file, and what we can do here is actually remove this layout and this flex. So we only have the card inside of that V dialog there. Okay. So the app reloaded already. Let's try to open up the panel again and you'll see it's fixed. Okay. So if I enlarge the window, if I change its size, the panel should not suffer the same previous behavior. Okay, and there is something else I would like to show you. As I was playing around with the code that we have, I noticed something, and this is something I also fixed already. But let's take a look on the already built app. So if I were to change some values here, but then close the panel, you'll notice that the value remains here as if I had saved it, and this is not something that we want to have in our application. Also, when we try to add a new remote, you'll see that we're not using that default in this version of the app. So I would like to leverage that in our newer code. Okay, so here we are in the settings dialog component, and you'll notice I did a couple things. So first, I created a new prop here, which is called defaults. What I'm doing here is I will be receiving an initial value for the defaults, and I will be creating basically two copies of that. One which will be the original settings. This will be like a fallback that we will use in just a moment. And then we have the settings property, which will be the one that drives the form over here. If you remember, we have the settings dot whatever, the model we're trying to use in the checkboxes and also in the text field right over here. So, but that's going to be a copy of the object. It's not going to point to the same reference as the this.defaults. So once I get it from the prop, I will be kind of unattaching that inside of this component. It's more or less what we did with the dialog when we created a computed property out of it. And then you'll notice that on close, we are checking if we're trying to close the panel right after we hit the save button. And if we didn't, we're going back to whatever those values were originally set. So this effectively will be the value that came in the props. And so what happens when we try to save, this means that we will, well, first write to that JSON file. It also means that we need to update this value so that we can have a new value to fall back whenever we decide we don't want to store those values. So in this case, I'm calling the close method and passing in this flag that lets the method know that I'm closing the panel after a save has been performed. Let's open up the app.view file. And in here, you'll see that I am binding to a default sprub, which is the one that I just showed you, and this is bound to a default values object. We are also not rendering this component until we have this variable available to us. And we're also not allowing the user to try and bring up the panel unless we have this one set. And this, you'll notice here, is a data property which is initialized to null and will only be assigned a value here after we have dispatched the load settings action. So in this case, we're waiting for this action to happen, and then when it does, we're going to get a hold of the result of that and assign it to the default values, which in turn will be passed into the dialog component as the initial or the default values for that form. And let me show you real quick how that action looks like now. All I'm doing now is I am returning whatever the settings variable end up being here, right? So when the load settings action finished the work, then the promise will be returned and the value for the successful callback will be sent on this line.